From the NewsChannel 5 network, this is OpenLine.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to OpenLine. Glad you are with us tonight. It's Wednesday, December 2nd, and tonight we're talking politics because the presidential transition is underway. There are all kinds of things going on with this transition. We will talk about what the next 4 years look like under President-elect Biden and talk about what we're seeing now with the division in this country and how President Trump is not conceding the election. So what does all that mean? Chance for you to call in and talk. Happy to have with us via Zoom. All of our guests now are via Zoom. And I think many of them like it because they can come to us just straight from their home. But I'm happy to have with us Dr. Thomas Schwartz, Vanderbilt Political Science Professor. Dr. Schwartz, thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me on the program.
So I am most interested in your historical perspective of where we stand right now. And where we stand is we have an incumbent president who is lost. I know that's rare. And we have a president who this far after the election is saying it was fraudulent, rigged, and is fighting the election. And so from a historical perspective, my first question to you is how unusual is this?
It's unusual in the 20th century. We've not really had anything like this. You have to go back to the sort of the first real transfer of power in 1800 to have as bitter a sequence as we're having right now. Namely, John Adams didn't attend the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson. He left Washington before it, which might happen with President Trump. He may not even attend Biden's inauguration. But you have to go back quite a ways. That's not been the tradition in American politics is the graceful loser. And that really, Donald Trump has decided to defy that tradition as he has done so many other traditions of the presidency. And he is certainly, made very much this to be his claim. And whether this will be designed to allow him to run again in 4 years or to inaugurate or to designate, say, one of his family members as the successor in 4 years, I don't know. But this does seem to be designed to seal the loyalty of his base and the Republican Party to him. I'm not sure it will work, but it certainly is designed in that way.
That appears to be his goal. And I'm interested to hear from you. It has happened before, that there is some precedence for this. Is there, and so that was a bitter time in American history, obviously a long time ago. They didn't have Twitter. Things have changed dramatically. But is there something we could learn about how, the impact on the next president when you have a current, past president saying the election was rigged and not kind of giving support with that traditional handoff?
That's hard to, what you do have. We do have some sequences in American history. I only mentioned the first one, the 1800. But in 1824, when John Adams was elected, he was elected in the House of Representatives. Andrew Jackson spent 4 years attacking him as a fraudulent president and sort of seeing him as someone who should not have been elected, that it was a dirty deal between him and Henry Clay that allowed Jackson to get the votes in the House of Representatives to win the White House. So you do have examples of that, of where a president has had to deal with someone attacking him for 4 years. In some ways, this also happened when Grover Cleveland lost to Benjamin Harrison. He attacked him for quite a bit during the 4 years afterwards, and then won re-election in 1892. And that would be the example that Trump could look at of a president who lost once, was out of office for 4 years, and then ran again and won. That was not necessarily good because the country had a terrible economic depression in his second term, but he did. He's the only president to serve two non-consecutive 4-year terms. So, but again, as I said, it's not a 20th century phenomenon. For a lot of reasons, presidents of the 20th century have felt the need to show a certain bipartisanship. The most bitter transition probably in the 20th century that took place was between Hoover and Roosevelt back in 1932. Hoover wanted Roosevelt to commit to a series of measures to deal with the Great Depression. Roosevelt didn't want to have anything to do with Hoover or be associated at all with Hoover, who he felt had failed. And it was a very bitter stretch. And in fact, there was an assassination attempt on Roosevelt during the transition that could have changed American history quite profoundly. But I do think we are in kind of unprecedented territory with Donald Trump's strong denials and his reluctance to accept the results of the election.
And all right, see, it's fascinating to hear about Hoover and Roosevelt. Was the party, or was the nation divided along party lines the way it is now? Was there a party that was backing Hoover and Roosevelt with the same sort of passion that we're seeing now?
I think not in the same way. The country was in such terrible shape, though. I mean, it does resemble the sort of dark winter that we've been talking about in terms of the coronavirus. During this period in the Depression, there were enormous numbers of bank failures. It was the lowest point in the Depression in terms of unemployment, failures of banks. People were genuinely fearful, so much so that Franklin Roosevelt's most famous line from his inaugural address is that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. In fact, people were very frightened. Roosevelt had a skill and a knack for communicating and was able to overcome that and certainly set those issues behind him very quickly. Hoover did not have strong support, but there were a lot of Republicans who were uneasy with what Roosevelt might represent, and certainly they would go into passionate opposition once he began his New Deal. But Roosevelt had overwhelming support in the country still.
All right, and looking historically, when we start talking about pardons, so President Trump, there's some talk that he is thinking about preemptively pardoning members of his family, and there was an article today about can he preemptively pardon himself? What about those questions? Can he do those things?
He certainly believes he has that authority. He's stated it quite directly. Preemptive pardons do exist. In a way, the most famous pardon that comes into play on this is the pardon that Gerald Ford gave Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had not been charged with anything when Ford pardoned him after he became president. There was always this cynicism that there was some sort of deal between Ford and Nixon. There wasn't, but Ford felt that a pardon was necessary for the country to get beyond Watergate. It probably backfired and probably cost him the election in '76, but in fact, many historians now think he was right to do that. That said, he did pardon him preemptively for the possibility of any charges against him in federal courts. The limits, of course, of the presidential pardon are for federal charges, so Donald Trump can still face all sorts of charges in state courts for offenses and violations. He can preemptively pardon some members of his family. It won't look very good. And of course, the argument is that if they didn't do anything wrong, why does he have to pardon them? But he certainly.
Well, I feel like what he would say. I feel like what he would say is that the Democrats are out to get me, and so I've got to protect my family, who, they're the victims in all this.
Yes, yeah, and there's no question that there are a lot of people who would like to prosecute members of the Trump administration. That is very clear. So he's not. Even a paranoid can have enemies, can have real enemies, and Donald Trump may be paranoid, but he has real enemies, and he has people who want to put him behind bars. So he does have, in that sense, it would not surprise me if he went ahead with the pardon.
Is there any sort of precedent for, well, I'm going to say the answer is no. Let me answer my own question, but I'll have you answer it more detailed and better articulately than that. But how unusual is it for a president to talk about pardoning himself preemptively? So Trump is saying he's talking about that. Number one, do you think he'll do that? Do you think he will say, cannot be prosecuted for crimes going forward, federal crimes? And is that even legal?
That will have to be determined. That is not that would require perhaps a determination by the Supreme Court whether he can do that. I think right now I'd say the chances of him preemptively pardoning himself are about 50-50. Joe Biden has indicated, for example, that he does not want to go ahead with all sorts of prosecutions. At the end of the Bush administration, there were a number of Democrats who wanted to go after various members of the Bush administration for violations on human rights, on terrorism, torture, these sorts of things. The Obama administration Justice Department ultimately decided not to do so, that it would cause too many problems. So I do think this has become a more common fixture of our politics, that we have looked for criminal offenses in past administrations, and the idea that they're there. I think right now it's not clear to me that he will do this, but he may, and that would be unprecedented for a president to pardon himself.
And I read an article today. All right, there's something about impeachment, obviously, in the Constitution. Right. A president could be impeached. If he's impeached, could he face charges? Theoretically, if he's thrown out of office, could he then face charges? And wouldn't that then mean that the writers of the Constitution didn't think that a president could pardon himself, or you wouldn't go that far?
I wouldn't go that far, because effectively impeachment is only basically the indictment. He would have had to have been convicted by the Senate. And if he was convicted by the Senate, he would be removed from office, but not charged criminally. So you can be convicted by the Senate and then set out of office, but not then face criminal charges outside. So that the impeachment and conviction remedy was simply to remove from political office, not necessarily to prosecute for criminal offenses.
And so here we have a new administration coming in. We have Joe Biden coming in. How difficult is it going to be, in your opinion, for Joe Biden going forward?
I actually think that because of his experience and because of his ties to much of the political establishment, and because of, in a way, his nature, he's not going to have a difficult time, I think, reestablishing some of the norms that President Trump has broken. He'll probably be well received by many Republicans. A number of them know him and have known him for a long time, his Senate colleagues and the rest. He may, part of this does depend in terms of his own agenda, political agenda. He may not be able to get much if the Democrats lose the Senate races in Georgia. If they win the Senate races in Georgia, there may be more pressure on him to push many of the ideas in the Democratic platform that might get a great deal of pushback from Republicans. But in fact, it might be more fortunate for him not to win in Georgia, in a sense that then most of what he would be able to do would be only through executive action, and he would be fairly limited in the scale of the types of changes he could push. He would have to really work for some sort of bipartisan approval, and that may be good in the end, that he would have to do that instead of sort of pushing solely a Democratic agenda.
That's interesting, that it could be in his interest, in a way, to not have total control of the Senate, because then you'd have 2 years where there would be an expectation to pass all kinds of more left-leaning policies. He won this nomination by being more moderate. And some said he was the only Democrat who could have won this. What do you think about that?
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think there is. He was voted for because he was not Donald Trump. It was not a resounding affirmation of Joe Biden. It was that he was not who Donald Trump had been, namely a very divisive, polarizing figure who, for many Americans, seemed really beyond the pale in terms of what they think of as president. And so he won. He carried out a very limited campaign. He didn't appear often. He focused on the coronavirus, which is a top concern for many Americans. And in that sense, I think his priorities, for example, and we're going to talk about these in some way, his number one priority is dealing with the virus. And until that's under control, as he made clear, he can't do anything else anyway, or he felt like he could not do many things in terms of the economy and other things. And so I think in that sense, he has a fairly modest agenda initially, but it's still very important to most Americans, namely making sure the vaccines get distributed, making sure that the country comes back then into a sort of normalcy that allows people to resume economic activity, and then to think about changes in taxes and other economic measures.
How much power do you think President Trump has over the next 4 years?
He could make life difficult. He could decide to try and carry out a sort of opposition presidency where he's trying to get into the media, attacking Biden on various proposals. It varies. I mean, Trump has a talent for being able to gain coverage. He could hold rallies. He could play the role that in a way that, you remember when one of the first places he visited after he became president was Andrew Jackson's home. He could play Andrew Jackson. He could play that this was an illegitimate election, and he could go around the country for 4 years doing that. I think Americans' appetite for that may be a bit limited right now. If Biden is cautious, there may not be this and focuses on things like just dealing with the virus and getting the economy back up. There may not be this desire for a sort of passionate opposition as quickly. This is why I do think it might be helpful that Biden doesn't have complete power, because in a way he wouldn't be able to undo the Trump agenda and give Trump the sort of talking points that he could go around the country proclaiming. In effect, he would be more limited, and Trump wouldn't be able to say, look what he's doing, it's destroying what I did, and this sort of thing. So in that way, it might work to also quiet Donald Trump for a period of time, although that is always questionable too, whether Donald Trump would desire to be quiet for any particular time before he starts his campaign again.
Yes.
There is talk that he may begin his campaign on January 20th. He may not attend the inaugural and hold a rally or give a speech saying, I'm going to start running for president on January 20th.
How much, and as we look back through history, the use of executive orders. Obviously, President Trump used executive orders. Barack Obama used executive orders. As the nation has become more divided, as the House and Senate don't seem capable often of doing big things, we've seen presidents use executive orders. So Donald Trump came in, he signed a bunch of executive orders. Again, so did President Obama. Now you're going to have Biden come in. What do you think we're going to see from him in the first 100 days? How much can he do just by executive order?
Well, this will be interesting. I mean, he may try through executive order to issue a mask mandate. This is something that's controversial, but also could be greeted, depending on the severity of the virus, might be greeted quite a bit by people around the country as a necessary measure. He will certainly rescind some of Trump's immigration orders, for example, the ban on Muslim countries. He may rescind some of the issues on the southern border. He may stop construction on the border wall. He may take a whole series of actions that are designed to slow down the immigration restriction, may propose opening up or changing the rules on immigration that are susceptible to presidential order. He will almost surely get rid of this notion that the census would not count undocumented people as part of the reapportionment. This is something that came before the Supreme Court because it was challenged, and the Supreme Court basically indicated that it might want to wait until next year to make a ruling, which undoubtedly will be withdrawn by President Biden. He doesn't want to do that. So those are some things. He will probably take some actions on abortion. For example, rescinding the Mexico City policy that banned American support, American funding to any groups abroad that provide for abortion. So he may do some things that are designed to appeal to parts of his base that are simply executive orders. And he will stretch the meaning of executive order undoubtedly, and that will probably come before the courts, just as many of President Trump's executive orders were stymied by the courts.
Are you concerned, and I don't know if concerned is the right word, are you, how closely are you watching, and again, I'm interested in where we stand in history, with just the use of executive orders? Are we seeing the power that the president have expand president after president after president. And I guess, are you concerned that presidents will just turn solely to executive order or rely too much on executive order, and they're in some ways bypassing the intent of the way things perhaps were designed to operate?
Well, I think you have to see presidential power in historical perspective. There's no question, for example, that during World War II and during the Cold War, presidents had enormous authority. Now, much of that authority was in foreign policy, but let's face it, during the Cold War, the president had the life and death. His finger was on the button, so to speak. And so that was that was a part of this growth of presidential authority. In fact, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a famous American historian, wrote a book in the 1970s called The Imperial Presidency to complain about the presidency's overarching powers. Congress had then, especially after Nixon's resignation, reasserted itself, particularly in foreign policy, passing various laws that prevented the president from sending troops for any period of time. So the interesting thing is now presidential authority, because of our polarization, seems to be primed more to deal with domestic issues, where I think Congress has normally really resisted this because they do have the funding power and they can stop the president on some of these things if they can muster sufficient numbers and prevent the funding of various objectives that the president has, like the wall, for example, his border wall under the Trump administration. So I think I'm concerned, but not. I think Congress on this issue will reflect at times public opinion, to the extent that if the president overreaches, President Biden has to be very worried, for example, about losing control of the House of Representatives in 2022. It looks like the Democrats' majority there is only going to be about 10 or 11 votes. So he's got the House of Representatives is very responsive to public opinion. So he has to be careful that he doesn't face what Barack Obama did in 2010 when he lost the House lost the House of Representatives overwhelmingly after the passage of Obamacare. So in a way, I'm not as concerned about this use of executive power, although I recognize that at times it really does flout the sort of founder's design of how the Constitution should work.
All right, there's so much more to talk about. We're going to take a break, come back, continue the discussion. And if you want to call in, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. We'll take a break, continue our discussion right after this.